Amen. Happy Sabbath. I missed you all last week. I wasn't presenting. So we had a 2-week break after the Canadian camp meeting. So this is a bit of a continuation from both the camp meeting and also what was taught prior to the camp meeting, that series we were working through in Australia. I'm not sure, about 8 presentations before the Canadian Zoom camp meeting. So we're now in late July. I just want to give a little bit of an overview of the journey that we've been on at least since December last year, and how these messages have progressed as far as what I've been choosing to focus on and teach. So I just want to give a little bit of an overview or a summary of where we've come. So we began, I'll begin it in around December. We understand that from August-September 2018 through to August-September 2019, it was a solid 12-month period, September to September, where the Midnight Cry was being taught, and it was progressing rapidly. It was an intense 12-month period that this movement went through. It climaxed at the September International Camp Meeting in Germany 1 year after it began, and it was there that equality was taught the most comprehensively. Also there we reframed our understanding of the Sunday law crisis, linking it to equality. It was the increase of knowledge of the early rain for the 144,000. So we particularly taught there equality and the Sunday law history, among other subjects as well. World War I completed the application of World War III. So more comprehensively was taught the subject of equality, the subject of the Sunday law, and the understanding of World War III, the information war the world is currently engulfed in, proving itself just as able to dismantle democracies as an actual war. So those are the subjects that particularly were wrapped up in September at the International Camp Meeting. As those subjects, that message came to a climax, we also had the final split that had been developing particularly for that same 1-year period as people rejected those messages. And we understand that FFA left the movement. So we had that shaking come to a climax at the same time as the messages came to their climax. After that, there was a period of quiet. I'll come back to what was taught at the conference directly after the camp meeting. But after that camp meeting in Germany, Elder Parminder and I both came to Australia, and there were a couple of things that were taught in the month of December. So I just want to start this subject from December, beginning with what was taught in Australia in late December. Can I have my step? Food. So in Australia in late December, there was a few presentations that were there taught, and it was particularly wanting to go back over the year that had just been, from January to that period in December 2019. So those meetings, late December 2019, it wasn't the camp meeting. The camp meeting, we discussed the counterfeit. That began to also be developed, as it will continue to develop. the understanding of the papacy and the meagre history of the papacy. That was further developed at the Australian camp meeting. Putting that to one side, I want to talk about late December. And what we discussed in late December as a group in Australia was what had occurred, the external events from January to December 2019, and how they fulfilled the expectations that had been taught, particularly when it comes to raffia, the fight between the United States and Russia over spheres of influence. And we titled this Dispensational Bookends. Doesn't show. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with a bookend. If you have a bookshelf and you have a certain amount of books and they tend to fall, they're usually specially created that there's something that can hold either side of those books to hold them upright. So you would have an object on either side, and it condenses, collates that material in one set area. So when we titled it Dispensational Bookends, we were talking about external events that held together a period of time, divided a period of time and held it. And that period of time was 2014 to 2019. So as we discussed the external events of 2019, whether it was Syria or Ukraine or Venezuela, or the United States itself, we recognized that the culmination of the events in 2019 could be pinned at their beginning point in 2014. 2014, when you have the United States enter the conflict in Syria, when you have Russia invade Ukraine, when you have those first protests rise in Venezuela. So you could see those external events. That's just a few examples of the conflicts that we'd been discussing, and you could bookend them with 2 years, not dates, years, 2014 and 2019. And all our lines are designed to do is go into that history, that massive information, break it down and make sense of it. So Australia, December 2019, we discussed this dispensation of 14 to 19, the external events and how they fulfilled prophecy, the lines we had been teaching. After Australia, the next meetings I held were in Kenya. And what was taught there, it was a number of things, but particularly it was what was taught in Australia retaught more comprehensively. So again, it was the dispensational bookends, those external events. That was December to January 2019 into 2020. After Kenya came Uganda, school and 2 camp meetings. Also, some meetings in South Sudan. So in Uganda, what was taught there, we moved from looking at these external events and we picked up something that had already been taught back in Germany. We went back to what had been taught at the German conference. So all through 2019, the messages, the reform lines were opening up in a more comprehensive fashion. Just to remind us what those reform lines are. Our reform lines, the Alpha and Omega histories of ancient Israel. These histories, Alpha and Omega of ancient, Alpha and Omega of modern, had been opening up through 2019 in a more comprehensive fashion. They were the foundation of this movement given in 1989. But we saw them more clearly. They weren't taught through 2019 because they didn't seem to be immediately relevant or needed. As soon as the shaking began to happen, it was recognized that these reform lines were crucial to understanding the internal experience that this movement was going through. And what was particularly taught, all of these were taught at the German conference in, I think, only one presentation. But all of the three, Alpha and Omega of ancient, Alpha of modern, were brought down to our own history to explain where we were on the reform lines. All histories were brought to our own. They explained the change in leadership, they explained the testing message, and they explained the test that we were currently in when it came to not just the message, but the test of organisation. And that is why it was taught at the German conference. Of any line that was highlighted more than any other was the history of John the Baptist and Christ. Why would that be? Why does it become so important to look at that history? When you're coming into the time of test, in the time of trouble, you want a history that most clearly reflects your own. And to clearly reflect it, it must be a history of, Brother Brendan says success, Brother Vol says success. Yes. So that reform line explains what to expect when the first group called is faced with a test and a disappointment in a history of success. And this reform line, based on failure and success that had been developed, particularly in Guadeloupe in 2019, these same reform lines are exactly what dismantled Elder Jeff's argument about half right and half wrong. They became relevant to dismantle his attacks in September of last year, and that is why they were opened up in such an extensive fashion to this movement right on time. In Uganda, we began to go back over particularly this history of success. because it continued to explain our present experience. So just to very quickly remind ourselves, people can start giving me those five dates. End of ancient Israel. Sorry, I've got another one. That's those 5 waymarks. Top 5 waymarks. Yes. The birth of Christ. The baptism of Christ. What's this waymark? We'll work our way through this history progressively. You have the birth not just of Christ but of John the Baptist, both born in 4 BC. Then you have Christ's baptism. Then you have the beginning of Christ's active ministry with the first temple cleansing. This is where the leadership of a movement is transferred from John the Baptist to Christ. This waymark. That's Christ's ministry. And then we come to the cross. And Pentecost. The disappointment in a history of success and the time of trouble. You have the harvest for a first group called. They're trained as teachers. They're shaken. They go through the furnace. They're prepared for service. At Pentecost, they go to work. Harvest for the second group called between Pentecost and what date? Give me this one. 34. It's the end of the 490 period that was cut off for the Jewish nation. Once that 490-year time prophecy comes to an end, we're told that the gospel could now go to who? The Gentiles, the world. From 34 AD to 70. Each period, each group going through a time of trouble. But we recognize the 144,000 and their role as teachers that are trained from the time of the end. As they're trained from the time of the end, some fall away. The symbol of the 144,000 at that group is which disciple? John the Revelator. He, after 70 AD, enters into his own time of trouble as that symbol. There's a death decree. They try to kill him. They can't. He is banished to the island of Patmos. And then what does he have? The privilege of witnessing. Ellen White describes it as Christ's second advent. His return to earth, down to the island of Patmos to speak with John. So I haven't filled in every waymark, but that they are all there. The sequence of events that step by step causes a group to be called and trained as teachers, then to be able to go back to their church, win as many people as possible in a set period of time before going to the Gentiles. Now at this waymark, 34 AD, this is the Sunday law. Where we give the gospel to the world. At 34 AD, what is that in Acts 27? It's shipwreck. So at shipwreck, the institutions of the United States and Adventism fall. At 34 AD, the institution of the nation of Israel as God's denominated people came to an end. Did the disciples stop attempting to reach Jews after 34 AD? No. So after the Sunday law, can we still attempt to win Adventists? Yes. This is how our understanding has progressed over time. We know as an institution it comes to an end. We know by then that we should have been able to reach many people with the message, but we don't cut people off. We don't stop trying to reach them. And that work of trying to reason and reach people will continue all the way to Michael standing up. Daniel 12:1. But this is the sequence of events. God can't reach his church unless he has teachers to reach them. God can't reach the world unless he has a church to reach the world. It must happen in this sequence of events. In our own time, what are these dates? (1989), the time of the end. 9/11. 2014, 2019, 2021. Then we have Sunday law, close of probation, second advent. Those are the same sequence of steps. End of ancient Israel, end of modern Israel. History of success, history of success. So when we want to understand what this difficult time period looks like for a people that are actually succeeding, where do you look? You look to that history of success. And that is what was taught from the German conference through the studies in Uganda. It was then taught in Brazil. The same subject was taught in Brazil at that camp meeting. It had grown a little. Then at the school in Portugal, we worked over the same history in a school setting more slowly and more comprehensively, trying to help people reason through each step. Towards the end of the school in Portugal, we moved from this line, the history of the meagre end of ancient Israel, to the beginning of modern Israel. We began to talk about our Alpha history. We understand that the beginning illustrates the end. We have an echo, if we can. The beginning illustrates the end, so we need to understand our Alpha history. That began to be taught at the end of the school in Portugal, and then in Australia we continued that same subject. And what we did is we took an overarching look at Protestantism from 1798 to the present day. This divide within Protestantism that you can see clearly in 1798 between two factions of Protestantism supporting two very different presidential candidates, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And how that split continued and grew through, particularly through the history of 1843, 44 and 45, the split of the three largest denominations in Protestantism over the subject, mostly over slavery, particularly the Baptist Church. You had the beginning of the Southern Baptist Convention, and how that split was also continued to be mirrored through climactic external events since that time period, whether it was the forming of the League of Nations or it was the civil rights movement. There's continued to be this kind of divide within Protestantism. And we went on a few detours there too. I want to just sum up this history of the end of ancient Israel and make a couple of points before continuing. Why has this history been repeated and repeated and repeated? The reason it has been repeated so frequently, in so much detail, is because many still do not see the danger that this history is warning us of. What it does is it shows us that we are in two places on this reform line. Two 40-day time periods. We have 40 days here after Christ's baptism, the 30 years of training to be a priest. We understood that originally as 1989 to 2019. After that, he goes into the wilderness, and there's the final steps of his preparation for ministry. He must confront Satan and defeat him. We have the 40-day time period after the cross, the time of trouble for the first group called. So we can take these two 40-day time periods and we drew two different lessons, two different tests. If you want to put it that way, two different ditches on either side of the road. Both of which were confronting this movement, particularly from around September last year. I won't repeat those studies. Everyone who followed the camp meeting that was done for Canada watched the final two presentations and should be familiar with what these two 40-day time periods were designed to teach us. And the warning they give us about two different ditches to fall into was the following. You have social conservative. And morally liberal. And this is when we spoke about the reforms. The true path that we were meant to follow is one of equality. If equality is the path in the middle, what are the two attacks on equality? One was taught comprehensively in that 12-month time period. It doesn't need repeating. The social conservative attacks on equality. If I was to put it this way, if you have a box and you say this box is full of people, and you want to say that all men are created equal, what the message did is highlighted, as you would a torch, it shone that beam on three specific areas where there have been repeated, systemic, centuries-old failures to treat people with equality. And those three areas were nationalism, that you see in one part in the racial divide in the United States, all stemming from 1619, the introduction of slavery into the British colonies, and we've discussed that at great detail. The issue of sexism, we've described that at great detail. The prevalence of that, in many areas still considered socially acceptable elements of that. And then the third, LGBTQ, how people are dehumanized, how the rights that a society should grant them, a society that separates church and state, such as the right to marry, have not been respected. So we discussed these three areas where society and God's people have so prevalently failed to treat people with social equality and respect. Since that time, since that message, we've been teaching about these two sides. This argument in the movement between moral liberalism and social conservatism. And what I've been trying to demonstrate is the problems with both. Rejecting social conservatism does not make us morally liberal. To say it a different way, to say that black and white people should be treated with not just equality but equity in the United States does not equal I can wear what I like, drink what I like, speak how I like, watch what I like. That is moral liberalism. And the way that this idea about freedom has been connected to the message of equality is incorrect. And that was taught at the meetings 2 weeks ago, and has been taught particularly intensely since Uganda. what I want to, it's not the subject, this is still the introduction, by the way. What I wanted to highlight was a particular problem with this side, this moral liberalism. People think that I've always been a conservatively minded person. It's amazing how those who claim that people judge quickly and jump to conclusions, judge quickly and come to conclusions. When it comes to these things, for example, high heels, I wore high heels so often that when walking barefoot, I would almost always walk on my toes. That was just the way I was accustomed to walking. I didn't walk on my heels because I'd worn high heels so extensively. I wouldn't leave the house without makeup. All of those things I understand, I have participated in. And I want us to think, or people to at least be aware of my perspective, why from the very beginning I said that this is a false view of equality, that this is the wrong road to take when the subject that we are addressing is equality. I really didn't like it in my younger days of wearing very little, when people would say I did that to get the attention of men. That's an argument people make. Oh, you're only wearing makeup to get a boy's attention. It's not a true argument. It is true that women dress for themselves, to dress to satisfy themselves, to satisfy other women. Don't want to make this all about women. Men do that too. But the reason that I would wear high heels was not to impress a boy. It's because I felt empowered. It gave me a sense of power and authority. And that is a false type of power. Men do not have to stand in Congress in thick makeup and high heels to speak with power and authority. This is a twisted form of equality. Whether it is the way we dress, high heels, earrings, makeup, all of those things, if we were to truly understand what God means when He says men and women are equal, we would see that not only do we not need those things, but that those things undermine our own equality. That's how they have been developed over time. So it's not saying that this side doesn't get equality and this side wants equality and more. Neither side understand equality. And to even have the feeling, I would feel more confident if I was teaching now in high heels and makeup. I know I would feel more confident because that sexism, that insecurity is instilled in me as a woman from the time that you're born. We're not teaching that those wearing earrings or makeup or participating in these things are evil people. That we're not teaching that they are in any ways disgusting or revolting or anything so ugly. What we are teaching is that the drive for those things is not a correct understanding of equality. It comes from a place of a wrong type of idea of empowerment and confidence, that they lead women to undermine their own message of equality. We must get back to the point of seeing what God means when He talks about equality, and it is not to take us in that direction. I want to make a couple more points about this subject. There's the idea of equality. That's the idea of feeling empowered. We have to understand what that empowerment is meant to come from. Is it meant to come from a correct understanding of the nature of God's kingdom, of the character of God, or is it an empowerment that we place on ourselves by the way that we are able to present ourselves with high heels and makeup And what I'm saying is that's a counterfeit. That is not equality. That directly undermines equality. What Ellen White was trying to do in the history in which she taught was that the reason that women were not taking part in the work, they were not standing shoulder to shoulder with the men in presenting the gospel in Millerite history, was because they spent all their time thinking about what they were wearing, what lace they were knitting, how wide were their hoops, and the fashion of the day. That focus the women had in that time period unfitted them to be involved in the work of the movement. She says clearly it unfits them for a work in the external political sphere of the United States. That focus on presenting ourselves in a certain light which men do not have to face, which for her time was still makeup, was still jewelry, but went into these ideas of adornment that also characteristic of her time. It unfitted them for giving the proper focus and attention, correctly understanding what God was trying to do. That also held back equality in our Alpha history. And to now take the message of equality and turn it back around into focusing on those same distractions, not just distractions, but things that undermine our message, is a counterfeit idea of empowerment, a counterfeit idea of equality. Neither side, neither ditch correctly understands equality. There is a road in the middle that does. How many people remain walking on it is still to be seen. There's the idea that this side speaks abusively, but this side is passionate. This side is just aggressive, and yet this side has a cause and can break the rules that they're trying to hold to this same side. I will give one example. I don't know how many different minority groups that we have on our chat, but I think we're all familiar with how a group of people are given some type of title that is dismissive, that is, if I can find the right word, perpetuates a stereotype, creates and then perpetuates a stereotype. This has happened all through history. If someone is a black man, they might find just one word or one phrase that puts all of them together and just denigrates him, dismisses him. This happens with women. Something like even an adjective like she's just bossy that might be said to a female politician that wouldn't be sent to a male. Those types of words, actually words that Donald Trump harnesses and uses, that with just either one word or at least something that can fit in a tweet can stereotype and disrespect an entire class of people. He does that with the black community when he continually refers to key black people as uneducated or somehow inferior in their intelligence. He does that so often to just a particular group of people that you know that he's actually creating a stereotype to diminish an entire subsection of society. Does that with women, does that with black people, does that with China. It's a tactic that they use. You black person, you woman, I'll give you a new one, you Karen. Do we not realize how incredibly offensive that type of messaging is? I want to read to you an article. Her name is Karen Strickler. She is president of the Vote Climate Political Action Committee. President of the Vote Climate Political Action Committee, what side of the external stream do you think she's on? Not Donald Trump's. The side that's willing to believe that climate change is an issue. She wrote an article for The Hill. It's an opinion contributor. She says, as a woman with the name Karen, I take personal offense to the cultural Karen stereotype and moniker. My response to it was visceral, and I need to speak up. I can already hear people saying, how Karen of you. The misnomer Karen might be a convenient shortcut to explaining the profound problem of racism and white entitlement. But it raises another problem, profound problem. Do not confront racism with sexism. It is misogynist stereotyping. Every nasty woman becomes a Karen. The term is often paired with other sexist put-downs like shrill or loud-mouthed. Calling a woman a Karen is simply another way of controlling women and their behaviour, telling us to be quiet and stop complaining. It legitimizes misogyny. I speak out about injustices, equal rights, and climate change. My view is on the other end of the political spectrum, but I'm sure that my opponents, Donald Trump's side, would prefer too that I was quiet. I will not be quiet. Does that make me a Karen? In their eyes, probably so. Some say this is not discriminatory because it applies to white women of privilege. Whatever its origins, Karen has turned into a pejorative directed only against people of a certain age, race, and gender, making it a slur by definition. Such an eponym serves no more useful purpose than any other offensive stereotype. In my own case, for example, although I am a middle-aged white woman, I do not use such privilege to victimize other people. Assigning an anonymous Karen moniker also lets other women who are behaving badly off the hook. They're no longer known by their own names and their own bad behavior, but by this stereotype. I am told I should keep my feelings to myself and not take offence, since the designation is clearly not meant for me. But I do not see it that way. There is nothing more personal than your name. It makes you stand out, distinguishes you, and ties you to your family and friends. Ironically, using the term Karen classically sees nobody as an individual. Stereotypes such as this one have the same adverse effect on society. Let us stop it already. The same way that someone might take, if you're a black person, think about your name. If other black people did something that became a stereotype, and your name became the name that was used every single time that a black person did a certain thing that reinforced that stereotype, what would be the extent, the offence that you would take with that? What would be the damage done to society? Is it okay for this side to do it just because they're fighting for equality? This is counterfeit equality. You can already see the compromises being made externally. And the problem is the compromises made externally are also the compromises made internally. What you see externally, you find internally. This side does not see equality. This side compromises. they also have a wrong understanding of equality. You see that externally, you see that internally. When it comes to the external, this is not to suggest that when it comes to racial justice, there isn't two streams of information. But as I have taught since Uganda, there's a new type of leadership being raised up. And these sources, as we've progressed, particularly from November until now, we have to see why in the US Civil War God judged the North. The South was gone, God judged the North. The North is this side. Because they teach equality, they claim to believe in equality, and yet they compromise. When it comes to the movement, the issue with moral liberalism, I've said before, is that they do not understand sexism. They don't practice equality correctly, and you see that with reforms. Reforms are not designed to hold women back. They're not designed to constrain the freedoms of women. They're designed to show women what equality looks like, that your confidence and your value should not come from what you wear. It's an empowering message, not a denigrating message, when understood correctly. The problem internally with this side is the same problem that happened in this movement at its very beginning. The beginning typifies its end. And the problem at the beginning, why did God have to work through Elder Jeff? Why did he have to work through someone so intensely conservative? Because he's the only one following the rules. He's the only one following the code, or his quote for quote, someone answered. If God is going to give an increase of knowledge, it has to be given to someone who already sees the Word of God as being inspired, not just in an overall concept of the great controversy, not just in an emotional kind of sense, but word for word, inspired Word of God. Through Genesis to Revelation, through the writings of Ellen White. He cannot give that increase of knowledge to a liberal who says, I don't care what the words say, I will eat what I like, drink what I like, wear what I like. He has to give that increase of knowledge to someone, however wrong his views are on social conservatism. The increase of knowledge from the time of the end had to be built upon someone that saw the inspiration in the Word of God, and that he could not sidestep that inspiration to do his own will. Only when you had such a solid foundation could you build upon it. So he was able to build upon Elder Jeff. For all Elder Jeff's wrong ideas, he could build upon that and create a message like upon John the Baptist that could be then taken up by Christ and brought to its true conclusion. Equality. So we have the same issue today. Neither side understand sexism. What about nationalism? This side, like the South in the Civil War, it doesn't understand those issues. You can see that. When we apply it to this movement, we find not that they are on that wrong side, but we have this issue, this legacy issue from our Alpha history. So there's this issue of nationalism confronted here. What about this side? Much of the arguments that are being made against the reforms, against moral liberalism, is the idea that this movement was not meant to have a second and a third leader. There was only meant to be one leader, And then somehow everyone was to lead themselves. It's attack on organisation. And when people attack organisation, it's usually from the platform of nationalism. My country has the right, the prerogative to organise how it likes, to practice how it likes, to practice even sexism how it likes, to teach what we like, to behave how we like. I addressed that in the Canada Zoom camp meeting. But this attack on leadership also comes from a foundation of nationalism. So which side understands correctly race or gender? Neither. The problem that we face is the same that we found in our Alpha history. This side doesn't understand race and gender. This side doesn't understand racism and sexism. However much they might defend race with claims like Karen, it demonstrates the inability to understand equality. Externally and internally. So when we come to this box that I've drawn here, these are the two areas where we fail the most systemically. Not just now, but I'm talking about the last 6,000 years of history. These are what God had to shine a spotlight on and continues to. But if you can't get equality here, can you get equality at all? No. So this side doesn't get equality. This side doesn't get equality. This side uses unkind language. This side is downright abusive. Neither side are practicing appropriate respect and equality. And the problem that we have as leadership in this movement is which side actually follows leadership. Same problem as back here. It's this side that doesn't follow and accept leadership within this movement. And as long as they don't accept and follow leadership within this movement, to what extent can we actually help them? It's not possible. It's not possible to reach people that already have no faith in Elder Parminder and myself as leaders. I'm speaking broadly, not of individuals. I hope no one takes this personally and thinks that I'm targeting a person. I'm targeting a mindset that is occurring within this movement. It's not possible to bring people back around to the true path if they already have no faith in the leadership of this movement and in organisation. This is the path that we have been on since September last year. The two sides that have confronted this movement. There's two ditches on the either side of that path of equality. Neither of those two ditches understand equality. Equality is to treat people appropriately, with kindness and respect. Recently, I don't know if people have followed those news sources, but recently in the United States, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez was accosted by a gentleman who then, as he left her after an argument, spoke about her in an extremely rude fashion. And she called him up on that. And what was his excuse? I won't apologize for being passionate. Passionate for my God, passionate for my country, passionate for my children. Passion, earnestness, is not an excuse for rudeness and misbehaviour. We can't use racial or sexist stereotypes against people. We shouldn't be justifying the use of a moniker like Karen either. Equality says you treat people with respect and kindness, how you would like to be spoken to and treated yourself. The problem externally is the problem internally. and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, again in makeup and high heels because she's as much a victim of sexism as everyone else, she called him out on it. And she said, passion is not an excuse for that level of disrespect. There is a path down the middle of these two ditches. What everyone needs to understand is how to find it for themselves, how to practice good behaviour. There is still a problem of this conservatism within the movement. There are still issues of tolerance towards people who are different to ourselves. I am not denying that that is an issue. What I'm saying is that so is this, and neither side is practicing correct behaviour towards the other. The only hope that people have, as I said all through the Canadian camp meeting, is go back to the lines. Those lines will tell you where you stand. They will tell you how to behave, not just in your personal life, not just in your church life. They will teach you how to view this movement as an organisation. They will teach you how to view external events on both sides of the political spectrum correctly and how to respond to those events correctly. Those lines keep us in the dead centre of that pathway. You let go of a line, you go into one ditch or the other ditch. Either ditch is not safe. Either ditch does not practice equality. This is what was taught, particularly from the time period in Uganda. Uganda, Brazil, Portugal, and also has been continually reinforced in Australia. The reason being is that this reform line, more than any other, tells us what our danger is in the time of trouble as priests. It's going to show us where we're safe and where we're not safe. This reform line cannot bear to be ignored. We must keep those histories in mind. The two 40-day difficult experiences in mind as we also go through a new understanding of our Alpha history. And that is what we have done in Australia, particularly over the last 2 months, and what I intend to continue from now on in. So we only have a short amount of time left. I haven't finished my introduction, and I know a sister had a question she wanted answered today, so I'll see if we get to that, but we might not. It might be next week. So what was taught over the last 2 months was a compare and contrast of ancient Israel and modern Israel. The three histories of ancient Israel. Too high. The three histories of ancient Israel as they come out of captivity, and from Egypt. They come out of the idolatry of Egypt, and what do? They create an Apis bull. They hold on to that paganism. They come out of Babylon. They have lost the idol, but they have the same mindset of the kingdom of God. So when they come out of Rome, what problem do they have? The same idolatry. They didn't rid themselves of the idolatry. And that's why even though there's no golden calf in Jerusalem in the time of Christ, they still failed because of their idolatry. Then we took that to modern Israel. Modern Israel, beginning with our Alpha history, Millerite, and ending with our Omega history. We have 1798, 1989. And what we have is failure, failure, success. Failure, failure, success. Ancient Israel held on to the mindset of paganism about the character of God. It caused them to fall in the end at the same time as a new movement was raised up. Modern Israel has replicated, compare and contrast that same experience, held on to the mindset of apostate Protestantism. Part of that mindset is conspiracy theories. It's why we labour those points. It's why at the Sunday law we understand the institutions of Adventism will be shipwrecked. So we have two histories of failure. Alpha history of failure, Millerite history. 1888 history, also as a history of failure. I'll just answer my sister's question before we close. She said, we do say, why do we say that Christ could have come in 1863 and 1888? So this movement teaches that Christ was meant to return in this history, here, and here. But there were failures that God's people made in both of those histories. And she's asked how we know that Christ was then meant to return. So I just want to give a few Ellen White quotes. First point, we don't teach that Christ was to return in 1888. I just want to make sure there isn't that misunderstanding. We teach 1888 was actually a Sunday law in a progression of events that would have led to Christ's second advent. And I'll speak about that again in a moment. So Christ was to return here. He didn't because of God's people failing. Christ was to return not in 1888, but in the sequence of events that 1888 was a part of. And we'll see Ellen White says just that. So to give a couple of quotes, Evangelism 694.2. Evangelism 694.2. The long night of gloom is trying, but the morning is deferred in mercy, because if the Master should come, so many would be found unready. God's unwillingness to have his people perish has been the reason for so long a delay. Christ could not have returned before 1798. I think we all understand that. There had to be the 1260, man of sin had to be revealed. After 1798, he could have returned. And Ellen White says that there has been a delay. The second advent has been deferred because too many of God's people would be found unready. She says that in 1868, so directly after, 5 years after 1863. Another quote from Life Sketches. Life Sketches 88. Three, two, one. Paragraph 1 and paragraph 3, and I'm just taking a small portion of paragraph 1. A conference was held at Battle Creek in May 1856. At the conference, a very solemn vision was given me. I saw that some of those present would be food for worms, some subjects for the 7 last plagues, and some would be translated to heaven at the second coming of Christ without seeing death. That last part, was anyone in that room translated to heaven at the second advent of Christ without seeing death? No. So what then do you do with that statement? From what Ellen White was told in 1856, there was the plan, the intention that Christ would come within the lifetime of those then living. There was to be 3 groups of people. Some would die and go into the ground. Some would die in the history of the plagues. Some would be translated at the second advent. The 3 groups within that room. And then she speaks about how one sister felt that she would be the one to soon die, and she suddenly did. Her health deteriorated. So there was a plan that there was meant to be the second advent in their lifetime. You come into the history of 1861, and what's James White saying? We think we see through the prophetic word the continuation of slavery down to the end of all earthly governments. They saw the Civil War as one of the final events before the second advent, because that issue of slavery would continue as it was in their time, that the literal slavery of black Americans culminating in the second advent of Christ. That was the position of James White, and he goes through the scriptural argument that he can base that upon. 1888 history. Evangelism 694.3. And 4. The work might have been done had the purpose of God been carried out by his people in giving to the world the message of mercy. Christ would, ere this, have come to the earth, and the saints would have received their welcome into the city of God. I know that if the people of God had preserved a living connection with him, if they had obeyed his word, they would today be in the heavenly Canaan. Those are 2 quotes from 1900 and 1903. One last quote. This doesn't directly relate to a time, but this is the great controversy. Remembering that it was published as in the 1888 version, but I'll go to the 1911 Great Controversy 573. In the movements now in progress, she's talking about the Sunday law movements that occurred in 1888. In the movements now in progress in the 1888 history, the United States, to secure for the institutions and usages of the Church of Protestantism the support of the state, Protestants are following in the steps of Papists. Nay, more, they are opening the door for the papacy to regain in Protestant America the supremacy which he had lost in the Old World. If the reader would understand the agencies to be employed in the soon coming contest, he has but to trace the record of the means which Rome employed for the same object in past ages. So in both of these histories, she's saying the same thing. She's saying that there are movements now in progress. Here it's the issue of slavery, as she phrases it in early writings, that would lead step by step through the time of trouble to the Second Advent, the sins of Babylon. And she says in this history, Christ will come in our lifetime, the lifetime of those living in 1856, and that by 1868, his Second Advent had already been delayed. Then you come into this history. Now you have the Great Controversy. This is early writings. This is Great Controversy. The history of Great Controversy, she's saying the Sunday law movements now in progress. Those movements are no longer in progress. So what do you do with that statement? The same thing you do with when she says to a group of people, some of you will witness the Second Advent without seeing death. You place it in its context. The context of early writings, it is not applicable today. You know it just didn't happen. The same with those movements for a Sunday law. Didn't happen. Failure and failure. The soon coming contest where those Sunday law issues, Sunday law movements would have led to a crisis as described in the Great Controversy did not happen, did not fail. So one final point before we close. I'm done with my introduction, almost. In this 1888 history, what was meant to happen? There was meant to be a national Sunday law sometime after 1888. This was to violate people's right of conscience. Then there was to be a close of probation, a death decree, and a Second Advent. So the issues, the movements in the United States were to lead on to a national Sunday law that violated people's rights of conscience. They were to face increasing persecution for keeping the Sabbath. Then probation was to close. They were to enter into a time of trouble. There was meant to be a death decree for Sabbath keepers. Those cataclysmic external events that would have destroyed the United States as a republic, they didn't happen. Why? Why didn't the cataclysmic external events occur? The failure of God's people. God's people were not ready. I want us to get the point of that. When you see strife externally, when you see Donald Trump elected in 2016, when you see the Republican horn of the United States fall and nationalistic dictators rise up all over the world, from India to Turkey to Poland, when you see this rise up, these external abusive dictatorships forming church and state unions, whether that church religion is Islam or Protestantism, or in the case of India, it's the Hindu religion. When you see those events, does that mean that this movement is failing or that we are succeeding in our mission? compare and contrast the two movements, the internal movement, the raising up of Elder Parminder, which I have repeatedly compared and contrasted with the rising up of Donald Trump. Compare and contrast the two sides of the great controversy. Forget the contrast. One is good, one is bad. Do the comparison. Why does the great controversy lead to a point of conflict? Because we are succeeding, and if we are succeeding, they are succeeding. The reason that the events here didn't lead to these cataclysmic external events is because the internal movement failed. If you see that these events externally de-escalate, that somehow there isn't persecution, that there isn't the steady progress towards our own Sunday law waymark, what does that tell you about this movement? Then we have failed. I want to make that point clear, because there is an idea in the movement that our failure to protest is responsible for Donald Trump, is responsible for the Sunday law, that the external stream that is so against equality would fail if this movement properly stood up and protested against them. And I want us to see that that not only is illogical, it breaks every line we have. It breaks ancient Israel. It breaks modern Israel. It breaks the study of the counterfeit. It breaks the compare and contrast between the movement in the United States and this movement, the internal. The reason that we see Donald Trump have success from 2016, 2017, 2018 is because he is the compare and contrast of the internal. That is why the great controversy comes to a point of conflict. You can't have that final war unless you see that both sides develop the strength to wage that war. So in conclusion, because I'm over time, what I've done is given a revision of how the studies have progressed, just the ones that I have taught from Australia in December, from the counterfeit to the dispensational bookends, the external fulfillments of raffia within the spheres of influence, then gone into this history, the Omega of ancient Israel, the three groups, and then the 144,000 that you find in their own time, breaking that down to identify where we are on those reform lines, both as it relates to us as the first group called, and as it relates to us as priests, as the priesthood. The two 40-day experiences, the two ditches on either side of the road, the path we're required to follow, what equality truly means, because priests after the cross do not understand the nature of the kingdom. It has to be reinforced and reinforced. At the same time, people are tested on whether or not they will listen to leadership at all. The same time we go through that crisis, we start to look at the beginning of modern Israel. Already it reinforces the fact that this movement is to organize. We taught that at the Canada Zoom camp meeting. This was all meant to be an introduction to explain Millerite history and to begin to have a deeper look at its structure as a reform line. We did a little detour at the end because I wanted to answer a sister's question about why we know Christ was meant to return in the history after 1888 that directly related to the movements of the Sunday law and the history of 1863, early writing slavery. I've done that just very quickly. I haven't built the structures from early writings and great controversy to reinforce that point. So if my sister or others have questions on that, I would recommend the presentations where the structures are based on the chapters, the sequencing that Ellen White places in those two manuscripts. I made a second point, that the reason there will be a Sunday law is because at the same time we are fitted to go to the world, who else is fitted to go to the world? Another movement that creates a national Sunday law that is ready to take down worldwide. This movement is prepared also with a message to also spread that worldwide. Sunday law, two movements. We succeed, they succeed. We fail, then we really will have peace externally. Just as they did after 1888. The movement failed, there was no death decree. I hope, as difficult as that is, it's also encouraging. It shows that these external events, the external persecution, is another evidence that however hard it is, we are fulfilling our role. We are on the right path. We need to consider what that path looks like. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for our blessings. Thank you for how you have guided us step by step for over 30 years now. Lord, we know that you have opened up light to your people through these reform lines, and we still see them open up. There's still much to be explored and understood. I pray, Lord, that you will anchor us, anchor each person on these reform lines, that not a soul must perish. I pray, Lord, that you'll give us a deeper understanding of what you mean when you say equality. What does this message mean for us individually? What does it require of us? I pray, Lord, that not that we will be a history of success, not that you will prepare us, because you already are and we're already told that you will, but I pray that we might be there, that we might be on the right side and see these things to their fulfillment. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.